I've played World of Warcraft for a total of 1400 hours, spent several weeks doing nothing but putting more than 200 hours into the Shadowlands expansion, and most WoW players would still agree that I am a filthy casual. A period of time that can mean full completion in one game is less than a drop in the bucket that is the full extent of World of Warcraft content. So if you're looking at my total/played time with WoW like that's the same amount of time that you might invest into a single raid tier, then this probably isn't going to be the video for you. I have neither the experience nor the breadth of knowledge it takes to talk about the highest difficulty content in the game, but what I do have is a good perspective on what your average gamer might experience with modern World of Warcraft. See, while I do personally love watching the content creators for this amazing game, the fact remains that most videos about Shadowlands are written either for current or returning players that already know exactly what they're getting into. After all, literal hundreds of millions of players have touched WoW at some point over its 16-year lifespan, meaning there's a lot of long-time players to cater to. Unfortunately, this makes it relatively hard for newcomers to really get an appreciation for why people love the game in the first place. You're just expected to know what it means to play WoW like it's normal for people to invest thousands of hours into a single game. So as one of those people who returns to the experience year after year, I feel a need to share my love for the game in a way that might help outsiders to the series understand just a little bit more. This isn't going to be one of my normal critiques where I try to go in depth on every facet of the game because that's just not possible with the scope of World of Warcraft. Instead, I'd like to take you on a journey through some of the best parts of the WoW experience, both inside and outside of the game. A casual's perspective on World of Warcraft Shadowlands. Playing World of Warcraft is pretty simple in its base form. You pick a race and a class to determine the character you control, explore the world, pick up quests, and kill monsters for loot. The combat system uses an old structure that was popular when WoW was released back in 2004, where the player has to select an enemy before using abilities that will automatically hit them as long as you are in range. This is referred to as the tab targeting system since the button you use to target the next enemy is tab if you don't want to actually click on them. In addition to the abilities a character has along the hotbar at the bottom of the screen, a player can also auto-attack an enemy as long as you're in combat, but that's not really how modern WoW is played. Instead, as you grow in level and experience, you'll unlock more and more abilities to use in different situations, allowing players to use spell after spell without ever taking a break to auto-attack in between. In order to keep the gameplay from devolving into a battle of who can press the buttons faster, the devs added in something called the global cooldown, or the GCD, that causes players to wait 1.5 seconds in between every button press. This leads to an even gameplay tempo where players are encouraged to activate a new ability every 1.5 seconds, and the skill of the player is measured by knowing what abilities to use in which order. By the end of the game, players will be stacking several buffs from abilities with cooldowns between 30 seconds to 5 minutes long in order to maximize the effectiveness of their abilities during short bursts of damage. Or they might be using basic abilities to earn resources that they need to unleash their more powerful attacks once they reach a certain threshold. Or they might start with a full bar of resources that they need to manage throughout a fight in order to heal their friends without running out of tools to use when things start to get dicey. But at its base nature, everyone is just pushing a button every 1.5 seconds while trying to make sure that the ability they use fits the situation at hand. What makes this interesting is the fact that max level characters will have the option between some 30 odd abilities at once, while also dodging projected enemy attacks, while also controlling your camera angle to try and get a better view of the battlefield, while also cycling through enemy monsters with tab targeting in order to attack the right bad guy, and it can be a lot to handle if you're just trying to directly click on the abilities on your hotbar at the bottom of the screen. So players developed a method of play where they hotkey every single one of their abilities to different keys on the keyboard, loosely centered around the normal movement keys of WASD. Then, by holding the right mouse button down, they can control the camera and easily strafe while the actual mouse cursor is used to target abilities and use context interactions that require a mouse over to use. To help make the gameplay a little bit easier to read, most players then install third-party add-ons to change the layout of the UI. pulling all the information closer to the center of the screens so that you can pay better attention to the actual character. Many players then take this one step further by downloading even further add-ons to make the maps easier to use or to track information about multiple characters at once. There's add-ons that help players use the in-game market more efficiently or tell you exactly what to do during each phase of a boss fight, and all these things that take the information expressed by the game itself and fine-tune it to display things in a way that's easier for modern audiences to understand. Ironically, this means that the game that you're watching me play right now only loosely represents the experience that players might have when they actually open the box and download WoW for the first time. The general use of hotkeys and mouse control of the camera are now simply taken for granted among the player base, since most of us have been playing like this for the last decade of our lives. Despite this, it wasn't until the release of Shadowlands pre-patch in 2020 that an updated tutorial area was added to the game that encourages players to use the mouse to turn their characters instead of the movement keys. And yet they still lead new players astray by automatically assigning your first couple abilities to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keys instead of the E, C, R, Q, and F keys. WoW is a weird beast of a game merely by the fact that it encourages players to use an inefficient control scheme that will end up hurting them further down the line. So why do people end up falling in love with the gameplay anyways? Simply put, because WoW rewards players no matter what skill level, time investment, or mechanical know-how you might have. If you want to play through the entire experience from level 1 to 60 without touching a single hotkey or add-on, then you can absolutely play the game like that. People go through the hassle of rebinding their keys and changing the interface specifically in order to challenge some of the hardest content in the game, but if that doesn't seem like your cup of tea, then you're still able to experience 99% of the game without ever coming close to being full tryhard. See, despite the fact that the new tutorial experience doesn't teach players how to play the game optimally, it does focus a lot of effort on introducing players to the overall gameplay loop of World of Warcraft. Namely, you click on a character with a floating exclamation point above their head, and they give you a blurb of text about their life story that you probably won't read, and then you're sent off on a mission. Maybe you're told to kill 10 murlocs, or apply first aid to some shipwrecked sailors, or free an interdimensional spirit from an energy force field. The spread of gameplay is truly enormous when one character will ask you to go till a farm and kill rats, while another character might ask you to kill a corrupted god or search an alternate timeline for an escaped genocide convict. This is a farmhand to divine being type of progression system for the player character that most Dungeons & Dragons enthusiasts can only hope of experiencing in a campaign. At the same time, this power progression from level 1 to current content is now represented by a 10 to 15 hour experience for a player that knows what they're doing, and perhaps a 30-hour journey if you're really trying to take in the sights. After the tutorial island where they teach players how to interact with objects, use quest-specific vehicles, and use the basic abilities in more efficient rotations, you'll be released upon the world either in the Horde capital of Orgrimmar or the Alliance capital of Stormwind. It used to be that players would then take an amazing race-style journey through each of the expansions in canonical order before reaching the current endgame expansion where the rest of the player base usually spends their time. But now that some changes took place in Shadowlands, players are instead encouraged to make their way through a single expansion's worth of content that's been level adjusted to fit your character strength from 10 to 50. First-time players will be forced into specifically completing the most recent expansion, Battle for Azeroth, since the developers wanted new players to just get caught up on the most recent storylines, while returning players who have a max level character will instead be able to choose from any of the expansions to get from level 10 to 50, theoretically allowing players that missed one of the expansions to get a general idea of what it might have felt like to level through that content. The end result of this? Meh. I didn't get the impression that the end result of this change met the reason the developers gave for the choose-your-own-adventure style. The character I had leveled through Warlords of Draenor reached 50 by the time I finished the 3rd leveling zone out of 5. The Wrath of the Lich King character was able to reach level 30 before I had even finished the 1st zone in that area. The Cataclysm character wasn't even allowed to start exploring the Cataclysm zones until level 30, and the Battle for Azeroth character ended up hitting some leveling walls during the new player experience, where it won't even let you continue the storyline until you grind side quests to make it to level 25 and unlock the 2nd world zone. If the purpose was really to explore old content as the current leveling experience, then the system was doomed from the start. Regardless of how perfectly they might have tailored the experience rewards to make you hit level 50 at exactly the same time you finish the last zone on each expansion, there's still the problem of where most of the story content in the game is focused. The meme behind World of Warcraft and most MMOs in general falls somewhere along the lines of, "Excuse me, you're not actually playing the game until you hit max level. Everything before that point is just outdated content that doesn't matter," which is typically going to be the same type of player that calls me a casual gamer regardless of how many hours I may have put in. But I've always felt like this is a naive argument because it's typically being made by players that have already seen all the content that came before whatever the current expansion is. After all, for the player that explored every inch of each expansion for the 2 long years that was the current piece of game world, then it is going to be an incredibly boring experience going back to the old haunting grounds for those individuals. But for the new player that hasn't experienced every part of the world when it was current, then this just represents a treasure trove of quests to complete, areas to explore, and storylines to see, while more serious players view it as dead content. The reason for this is because most players experience the most fun in the game doing new stuff with friends, and you'll be lucky to find anyone playing through the old expansions half the time. And while you could go back with a high-level character in order to solo all the content that used to be designed for groups of 5 to 40 people, it just feels kind of weird one-shotting a boss that you know large groups of players struggle with for weeks. The worst part of this all comes into play when you realize that almost all of the storylines in each expansion end up resolving during the 1 to 4 end-of-patch raids, which are typically designed for groups of 25 players. So when this is modern content, it gives large groups of players both a story reason, a community reason, and a loot reason to play through the hardest group content in each patch in order to receive the most valuable rewards available at the time. But going back to the new leveling experience, and let's say that the math checks out. You hit level 50 at exactly the same time as you finish the last storyline in the last zone of the expansion you chose to explore. Well, now you have all the basic lore under your belt, you understand a little bit about the people that live on that continent, and maybe received a little backstory on the key villain, but then what? You'd have to move on to Shadowlands content in order to keep progressing your character, and you're more or less forced to abandon all of the storylines in that area that you just explored since no one else is doing the old raids anymore. The only chance you have to see the old content and finish those plot threads is typically going to be to level to 60, farm up at least a little endgame gear, and go back to one-shot all of those bosses, undermining the real gravitas of defeating Arthas the Lich King for your first time ever. And with the recent changes to the leveling system, the only gross positive I can see is the fact that the entire experience takes less time, practically cutting the level 1 through 50 journey in half, because a new player honestly should be told to expect that you won't be able to see an actual story play out until you make your way to the current content. Sure, you'll encounter the small vignettes and plot threads as you make your way through each of the leveling zones on the continent, but this is often considered to be the weakest writing in the entire game, especially as you go back into the older and older content. And on top of missing the raid storylines, the new player experience misses out on most of the endgame zones for each continent like Nazjatar, Megagon, Argus, and the Isle of Thunder, which were often some of the highlights for each expansion depending on who you ask. So why am I going into so much detail, shit-talking the narrative experience as you make your first journey through the world? Well, simply put, because I think there's a decent number of people that do view World of Warcraft as a narrative experience, and even possibly one of the best ones for long-term lore. After all, there's several incredibly popular YouTube channels devoted entirely to telling the stories of World of Warcraft, recounting the history of this world, and unveiling whispers and teases of what might come in the future. It could even be argued that the amount of human effort that has gone into compiling the historical merit of World of Warcraft is more than likely surpassing the number of man-hours invested into researching some of the ancient civilizations in our own world. And between the novellas, comic books, cinematic shorts, prequel games, and panel discussions about the lore, I know there has to be at least some portion of people that walked into this game expecting a solid narrative, which unfortunately isn't that easy to find once you're actually playing. There are currently around 24,000 quests in the game, each introduced with 5 to 7 lines of dialogue, which most players will just end up skipping. Half of this is motivated by the fact that the context of why you're doing something doesn't matter as much to people as what the actual rewards are, alongside the fact that many people will have played through the same initial couple hundred quests that lie on the main path of travel over and over again with each new character. So when I've already completed the 3 quests linked to the Burning Crusade dungeon called Hellfire Ramparts on almost every one of my characters that made it through the old leveling system, I'm disincentivized to even look at the flavor text by this point in time. In the exact same breath, I'm criticizing the storytelling of WoW while also confiding the fact that I don't even read the quest text most of the time, leading to an awkward game of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Do people think the story is bad because they don't read the quest text, or do people stop reading the quest text because the writing is bad? The solution that Blizzard ended up deciding on was to simply turn most of the story-focused sections into in-game events and cinematics. Important scenes are typically voice-acted and may either force the player to follow an escort NPC while they talk to you, completing mundane tasks with a long cast time, or attaching companion characters that will help you in battle while telling you their life stories. Even just the voice acting alone on some of the in-game events does a lot of good towards keeping the player's attention when they're otherwise used to pressing a button every 1.5 seconds in combat. After all, it's a big stopping point in the gameplay flow when you've just killed 100 enemies in 10 minutes, but the game wants you to take 30 to 60 seconds just reading blocks of text in between each spurt of combat. But now that we have all these new tools trying to convey the message of the underlying plot regardless of quest text, it's easy for players that don't like reading to follow along like the simple-minded DPS machines we like to think of ourselves. The only problem with this is the fact that it's a halfway solution. As I'm working my way through the new quest lines in Shadowlands, I had a general idea of what happened in the plot. I'm doing this stuff in Bastion in order to earn the right to talk to their leader, or I'm fighting these enemies in Maldraxxus in order to help out Draka. The key beats are there, but why do I specifically need to kill 10 of this specific enemy or a different one? Don't really know, and I didn't care to know. It might have mattered to me the first couple times I went on a kill mission, but when that becomes dozens of times, then hundreds of times, then thousands of times that some random quest giver has told me to go kill 10 enemies with a specific name, how can I care about the reasoning by this point in time? Hence the reason why veterans of the game don't really tell people to pick up World of Warcraft for the plotline. The key appeal to MMOs has always been the ability to simply exist in that world instead of experiencing it. Let me back up there because that's a loaded statement. Take your average RPG like the Dragon Age games where you pick a race and a class and the combat works somewhat similarly to tab targeting. It's whatever. The point is, in these single-player RPGs, you are being catered to. There's typically only one way through the storyline from beginning to end, and however much it might branch depending on your decisions, the same major story beats are going to be hit by you as the main character. Your avatar is thus a medium by which the narrative RPG tells you a story about its world and the conflicts it wants to explore. Now, You can certainly find this in MMOs as well as you work your way through the main questline in each expansion. However, there's only so much of this content to go around. You might be lucky to get 10 hours of plotline focused gameplay out of each addition to the game, so this definitely isn't a place where players invest the thousands of hours that they do. Instead, the focus of the MMO seems to fall on a player character simply being one of the many characters in an interactive sandbox. Even when you're doing the really epic stuff like killing gods, you're always doing so as a single member of an unnamed group of adventurers. Maybe you are someone strong enough to bask in the presence of these historical figures like Thrall and Jaina, which many people know about even outside of World of Warcraft, but the player character will never be attributed as the cause of any lasting effects to this world. So if the big bad guys at the end of the dungeon just respawn the next time you reload the area, it changes the way that people think about a video game. It's no longer good enough to simply fight the boss and save the nearby village, since the boss and the village are stuck in this never-ending loop as many times as you decide to go back to that area, negating any narrative consequence that your actions might have on the world. Instead, the purpose behind killing said boss lies in what he can give the player, whether they can give you any gear that will make you more powerful, a mount to ride around on and look cool while you go in circles around Dalaran, a cosmetic pet that will follow you around, or even just a boatload of gold to spend on things that you actually want. The focus has shifted away from how you can affect the world to how the world can affect what you can do. So, to wrap back to the statement that started this tangent, the key appeal of MMOs has always been the ability to simply exist in that world instead of experiencing it. This isn't just a one and done, make your way through the story and then put things down type of game. As long as you keep investing time into World of Warcraft, it will keep rewarding you in a wide variety of ways. And then this pays off for the developer since the game runs on a subscription model as players pay $13 to $15 per month just for the privilege of putting more time into World of Warcraft. It's not a gacha game in the normal sense where you pay money to open up random loot boxes, but instead you invest your time into a slot machine otherwise known as a raid boss. If he doesn't give you what you want when you kill him, I don't know, come back next week and maybe he'll drop the right item. But don't forget to pay your subscription fee first. So when the game starts new players off with a steady stream of mounts and cosmetics and character levels and easy gear and oh my god, so many rewards, it feels like you're really accomplishing something every time you open the game. Then you finish all the easy stuff, and you start looking at the mounts that might take you 10 hours of grinding for a currency, or there's a specific piece of gear that you think looks really cool, but it only has a 1% drop chance, and you only get one opportunity to pull the lever each week, and suddenly the entire structure of the WoW experience starts to seem incredibly manipulative and specifically designed to be addictive. Whether this seems enticing to a player or not depends on the amount of joy they receive from walking on the treadmill. Cable TV is debatably less rewarding than the WoW slot machine, and yet upwards of 70% of American households are still willing to pay $60 a month to stare at a screen in that sense. So it's unsurprising that several million people have decided that World of Warcraft is worth investing their free time into as well as their money. But this is all starting to take a very dystopian view of modern society, so I better get back to analyzing the things that people actually enjoy doing in WoW. And the variety is pretty impressive. There's your typical combat-focused players, but you can also spend your time gathering resources, making things with the profession system, playing the Pokemon-style pet battler, becoming an auction house millionaire, role-playing, speedrunning, player versus player, solving hidden puzzles, grinding reputations, secondary professions, achievement hunting, exploring the world, and working through some of the class-specific content like Warlock Green Fire, all of which can individually provide more man-hours worth of content than your typical AAA release, and all of which are optional time investments that you can completely ignore if you don't like a particular mechanic or reward system. It's downright impressive the amount of different systems and just random things you can explore in the game along with the rewards for doing so. Yet many players refuse to acknowledge half the things I just listed as legitimate content for the game simply due to the difficulty. Up until the point you hit max level, a player is unlikely to be challenged by the game in any way unless you start to play greedy by pulling several enemies at once and speed things up. In a 1v1 fight against any monster during the leveling experience, the player is designed to win. You're not supposed to fail, and even when you do die on rare occasion, your character will immediately respawn as a ghost, forcing you to walk for maybe 60 seconds back to your corpse before continuing right where you left off. You don't drop anything when you die, you don't lose experience, it's barely a time loss, and the only real penalty, the durability damage to your gear, only takes pennies to repair every couple of hours. Just like the reward system for WoW, the leveling experience is designed to be a one-way track without any major challenge up until the very point you reach the end game. It's at this max level situation where players are first given the chance to actually challenge themselves with scaling content and rewards that match the level of effort that they put in. For 5-man dungeon content, this comes in the form of Mythic Plus, which allows players to complete keys of increasing difficulty and several affixes to change the way that enemies interact with the player. If your group can both defeat a certain number of adds in the dungeon while defeating all the bosses under a time limit, you're rewarded with a chest that can sometimes give a player high-level loot. Similarly, as players progress through the raid difficulties with normal to heroic to mythic, they will face increasingly difficult boss battles which add new mechanics to their fight as you raise the difficulty, while also asking players to meet higher and higher DPS checks over time. Or in the case of PvP, you can create a pre-made group to enter the ranked mode for arena battles and battlegrounds as you gradually work your way up an MMR system and get matched against players of a similar skill level. But then again, you can just as easily participate in all that same content on an easier difficulty for lower rewards. Play a couple heroic dungeons instead of pushing yourself with Mythic Plus. Enter the looking for raid system for an easy chance to see the story moments without half of the challenge. Or simply queuing for a couple unrated battlegrounds to blow off steam after work against players that are taking the game just as not seriously as you are. Sure, there are rewards attached to those higher difficulties like cooler cosmetic gear, rare mounts, and achievements, but given the hundreds of gear sets and mounts that you can farm solo back in older expansions, do you think it's worth putting in the time to challenge yourself on those harder difficulties? It's a deeply personal question that depends on a lot of factors that might not even always have to do with the game itself. Things like whether your internet connection is strong enough to participate in raids, or whether your computer is good enough to get above 20 frames per second, how much free time you have to invest after work, whether you have enough cash flow to keep a subscription for long periods of time, or even just the physical ability to make game inputs fast enough to keep up for whatever reason you might be injured or handicapped by life. When you have the privilege, it's easy to scoff at someone who claims they're not in a good life situation to put in the effort, but then there's another group of people that just don't believe that the rewards match the amount of time you would have to put into these systems to achieve them. Before I go any further, I need to explain what being a casual at the game actually means to me. Over the course of several expansions, I've gotten every single class to max level at some point in time. I've currently got 4 max level characters and completed all of the Covenant campaigns. I've earned the Pathfinder achievement and unlocked flying on every expansion since Warlords of Draenor. I've unlocked all the allied races they've released up until this point, and possibly my proudest achievement is the fact that I've earned the Red Water Strider fishing mount back when it could still walk on water. So the reason why this all makes me a casual is the fact that I'm not really concerned with the endgame content as much as other people. I've only done a handful of Mythic Plus dungeons, I've never stepped into a raid above LFR difficulty, and I've never played in a rated battleground. Ironically, this actually puts me in the vast majority of World of Warcraft players. it's hard to prove this since the company that makes WoW, named Blizzard, tends to keep this information secret for marketing reasons, but we can find several interesting numbers through third-party add-ons and forum posts. So starting with the Mythic Plus scene, which represents the endgame 5-man group dungeon content, most players use an add-on called Raider.io in order to help find better groups and track their progress. At the arguable height of Mythic Plus popularity back during the Legion expansion, Raider.io reported 4.4 million characters recorded as doing at least one dungeon. Mind you, this is the number of characters and not accounts, so many of those data points represent a single player doing Mythic Plus on multiple alts. So let's be conservative and say that the average number of characters a player uses on Mythic Plus is 2. And suddenly those 4.4 million characters only represent 2.2 million accounts, which, considering the lowest reported number of subscriptions was around 5.5 million back in 2015, would mean that 40% of players have played Mythic Plus at all. And considering a record 3.7 million players bought the Shadowlands expansion on its day one release, it's more than likely that more players are returning to WoW than ever before, driving the percentage that participate in Mythic Plus even lower. The statistics for rating are even more grave depending on the info that you can find. According to a WoW Champ analysis of 2.7 million max level characters, only 1.35% had completed the Firelands raid back in patch 4.2. Likewise, near the same time period, WoW had reported a 1.56% of guilds as completing Heroic Deathwing back when that was current content. Since then, raids have become much more inviting to the general player base as it becomes easier to set up raid groups in the newer Flex systems. So, based on some achievement percentages back during the final patch of Warlords of Draenor, Wowhead profiles reported 61% of players completing LFR Archimond, 41% on normal difficulty, 37% for heroic difficulty, and 5% for mythic cutting edge. Mind you, this is once again based on the type of player that creates an account for Wowhead, which is already above and beyond what your casual player is going to do for the game, but the numbers are still relatively low. Then when we look at the rated PvP system, we can back into the total number of players in each season of PvP by looking at the WoW ladders, which at its battle for Azeroth peak tracked a total of 334,000 players, which would later go down to a total of 91,000 players near the end of the expansion. Now, I hardly even need to do the math on this one because that's less than 10% of players who even pre-ordered Shadowlands. So between all of these statistics that I honestly can't confirm as true because Blizzard never releases the hard data on these things, but it certainly looks like 60% of players never step foot in any content harder than LFR, Heroic Dungeons, and Unranked PvP. This is the vast majority of the player base deciding not to engage in any type of content that could honestly be described as difficult, since nothing in the base game is actually designed to challenge a player in this same way. And yet, millions of players log in every month to do just that. So, what are we, the average player, spending our time on? The unfortunate answer is, it depends. Like I mentioned before, there are so many facets and systems to the WoW experience that I can't even nail down any hard answers about what people do other than have fun. 30% of players have the achievement for owning 100 mounts, which I think represents the point at which players will have to actually put in effort in order to start earning new mounts, and could be considered mount farming. 48% of players like the battle pet system enough to win 250 pet battles, which is a surprisingly large number of people considering how hard the general player base memes about this minigame. 34% of players have earned at least 10 full transmog sets across all of their characters, marking at least some effort put into transmog farming. 66% of players have earned the revered reputation with the standard factions from BFA, marking a consistent effort put towards the World Quest system. And finally, 69% of players have at least 5 max level characters, making alt leveling one of the most popular overall things to do in World of Warcraft. I'll throw on some more statistics on the screen if you wanted to read them, but the point of the matter is that there isn't one particular form of content that marks a casual player other than the fact that they aren't accessing content that can't be done with the automatic group finder. Instead, I'd suggest that most casual players find their time dominated by certain projects and goals that they set themselves. While one person might try to get every class to max level during a single expansion, another player just wants to complete the most recent raid finder set on their main character, and both of these goals give them something to strive for, something they can log in every day or once a week and make progress on in the way that can't be taken from the player. Then, once you've achieved said goal, you've more than likely had enough time to already know exactly what you want to do next and move right on to another project. It's such an ingenious way to motivate players to spend more and more time with the game, since all of the nuance behind the system lies with the player. See, when you start a new character in WoW and get through the tutorial zone experience, there's nothing actually telling players what they need to do next. You can choose to go to any prior expansion, and even once you're there, the game kind of just drops you off at the dock and says, have fun, see you in a couple hours, letting the onus of progression fall on the player's shoulders. The same thing that undermines the storytelling of the world is also what gives the player a chance to make their own story and set their own goals. Now, by nudging the player into choosing a campaign to time walk in and getting them to distant shores in the first place, it's already conditioning the player to think that the initial goal is to follow whatever storyline they can find and get to max level, which is on its own a fine enough goal to have since it will make everything else easier to do. Or let's say the player had fun in the mini dungeon experience during the tutorial zone, and now they want to try doing a couple in the open world, and you suddenly realize that it's just as easy to get to max level by working your way through all the classic dungeons. Maybe a player chose to go to Pandaria or Warlords of Draenor and found a couple hidden treasures before figuring out that you can look up a treasure guide and spend a couple hours just wandering around picking up collectibles for experience points. Or you can choose to level in Legion and suddenly find yourself in an area affected by the periodic demon assaults where you can do world quests for massive XP gains in a small amount of time. It seems like every time I try to talk about a new topic for the game, I go into a tirade listing off a ton of different options, one after another, because that's kind of the whole point. WoW represents the famous Sid Meier's quote that good video games are a series of interesting options, by letting the player choose who to start their game as, then how to level, and finally what to do at endgame. And I don't know how to show this any better than to share a story about what I ended up doing over the last couple expansions for the game. Between Classic and 2016, I kind of passively interacted with World of Warcraft, jumping in for a couple of levels before getting bored and quitting shortly after when the game failed to give me a good sense of direction. I never had anything waiting for me at max level, so I never really fell head over heels for the game until the launch of the Legion expansion and the release of allied races. For some reason, these cosmetic upgrades to unlock new options for the character creator were incredibly important for me. Just the idea of being able to play as a Void Elf sounded cool, and I was willing to put in the effort to make that happen. Regardless of how slow my journey to max level might have been compared to the dozen hours it takes me today, I think it took me less than 40 hours on this feral druid meant to unlock the allied races. After that, I remember it taking me until around 7 days worth of played time doing random adventures around Argus and the daily quests required to reach Exalted Reputation with the Argusian Reach. Every week I could do the weekly major invasion for a large hit of rep, along with the weekly quest, and then return to grinding world quests day in and day out for just the tiny bits of reputation that got me closer to my end goal. I wasn't doing anything particularly hard. I could log in and wipe up any new world quests within around an hour of gameplay each day, but there was enough drive to keep me going, regardless of how boring it might be doing the same quests over and over and over for weeks on end. This was the click moment in my mind where I started to understand why people love WoW so much, whether it's because they want to challenge harder content or just grind world quests for reputation all day. There's a real sense that you are getting better and stronger with every moment invested into the game, so that the next time you attack that monster, it might take just one fewer hit to kill them. And even with the knowledge that your character will essentially get rolled back from max level when the new expansion releases, your character will still be getting stronger, eventually capable of taking on content that you might not have been able to do in the last expansion. It truly is the power fantasy that spawned an entire anime genre where people get transported into MMOs along with the easy ladder steps that feel as good to experience for yourself as they are to watch in those various shows. Ironically, the reputation that I needed to finally unlock the Void Elf faction just so happened to be one of the harder reputations to grind in Legion, allowing me to also unlock the reputations I needed for all of the other allied races at the same time. But then one day, I realized I was close enough to the end goal to pull out the last 1,000 reputation points or so, and the entire experience passed like I was lost in a haze. It's one thing to get lucky and pull a 1% drop rate item from a boss, but when the statistic you're looking for is a much more finite goal, something you can get one step closer to every single day, that's the type of grind that feels good in my soul, knowing that it was the effort I put in, and the 120 hours I put into those world quests that made the difference, since it wasn't just a lucky draw from a hat. It made things feel like I had earned my goal in a way that you only rarely get to experience in real life, and I was hooked. I immediately re-rolled to a Void Elf Rogue as soon as I had them unlocked, and took my second journey from 1 to 100. A couple days later, and already I was at the same spot my druid used to stand doing world quests each day, but what was I going to do now? Well, something I noticed from a lot of players going through the leveling experience was the sheer utility of the water walking mounts that only dropped from a handful of events in the entire game. Sure, I could do things the basic way and farm some fishing world quests in Pandaria in order to unlock the blue water strider, but I wanted to do something special and set myself apart. Obviously, I chose to grind out the red water strider, like that makes any difference in the world, but I had a purpose and I was going to look cool. It was Dark Moon Fair week, and I knew the waters there would let you catch some decent enough stuff even if you were fishing level 0, and so I began my fishing journey of the ages. Now, when I decided to earn the red water strider, I inadvertently decided to take on one of the hardest fishing grinds in the entire game, especially as a player who never fished up until that point in time. It's a vendor item, so theoretically it should be as easy as earning 100 of Nat's lucky coins from the Warlords of Draenor expansion, except that this is only the last step in a long line of events. First, you're going to want to level your fishing up to max level, since the rare fish we're going to be catching get a higher drop chance the better your fishing skill. But then to even unlock the vendor that stocks this item, we're going to need to unlock the level 3 fishing hut. The level 1 fishing hut is pretty simple since you're going to pick up a random quest for it in your garrison, and then the level 2 fishing hut is a simple gold purchase away. But the level 3 fishing hut requires an achievement called the Draenor Angler. This required the player to catch 100 of the largest type of fish in each of 7 specific areas, each of which has a 33% drop chance on each fishing attempt without any modifiers. But you get through this step and upgrade the fishing hut to level 3 and unlock the handful of quests to get a man named Nat Pagel to join your crew, finally unlocking the vendor we've been working towards. This is where things get fun, since Nat will sell you a bait that unlocks a chance to catch the rarest types of fish in each area of Draenor called the Lurkers. These 1% drop chance fish can then be turned into Nat Pagel for a single lucky coin each, or you can find several ways to boost your fishing skill above the maximum level in order to make the drop chance just a little bit better. I personally ended up going through the Legion fishing meta achievement in order to unlock the legendary fishing artifact, specifically to boost my chances of catching the Draenor lurkers in less time. This of course required me to catch another 18 rare fish that have between a 1% to 5% chance to spawn, depending on if you can find some fishing pools in the water to increase your chances. But now I had the legendary fishing rod, the right bait from Nat Pagel, and the final grind for the lucky coins was just about in sight. Let's take a step back to look at how much time this actually requires from the player. At 10 seconds a cast, and maybe 1 second in between each cast, I'll say it takes 11 seconds per fishing attempt. At the time I got this mount, the max fishing level was 800, and given a decent place to level up the fishing skill like the Dark Moon Fair, I'd say you can probably get a skill increase once every 2 casts. So 800 skill levels times 2 casts times 11 seconds is around 293 minutes, or almost 5 hours. Not too bad so far, but then we have to unlock the meta achievements for Draenor, which is going to take 700 fish at a 33% drop chance, so 700 times 3 times 11 seconds, and that's 385 minutes or 6.5 hours. Then let's say you make your way into the final lucky coin grind without going for any of the fishing bonuses like the artifact fishing pool, at which point 100 fish times 1% drop chance times 11 seconds should take around 1,833 minutes or 30.5 hours. Alternatively, I decided to catch the 18 5% drop rate fish in Legion for the artifact fishing pool, which took around 66 minutes based on the same math, and may or may not have increased the drop rate of lurkers in the Draenor area, since no one is 100% sure on what affects the drop rates. So before we even factor in the time I spent researching this process and the time it took to ride a ground mount in between each of the tidal pools in these areas, that's still 43 hours of just fishing. So if I count the 10 to 15 hours I probably spent riding around the world to these fishing areas and messing up the bobber minigame after zoning out after several hours of actual fishing in a row, this might have looked closer to 58 hours of gameplay for just a single mount. If you like the fishing minigame, this is frankly kind of amazing. That's more gameplay in just this one grind than most RPGs have available. And this is just a single secondary profession that isn't even the main point of the game. A grind that not only rewarded me for completing it by having a cool looking new mount, but also the ability for my mount to walk on water before the devs patched things to make this available via accessories. I was on top of the world, and even the fact that the water walking boots I just mentioned were added to the game with the very next expansion, somewhat limiting the usefulness of my time investment, I will never stop being proud of the Crimson Water Strider every single time I pull it out. My World of Warcraft story is the progression through project after project as Battle for Azeroth came out, and I spent most of my time unlocking all the new allied races, then going back to unlock the Pathfinder achievements, and flying in all the previous expansions. These are the type of things that came naturally to players who tackled the hardest content in the game, as they were also doing the world quests each day for Azerite points in order to use the perks on their gear. But for me and many others, this was the whole game. The long-term investment that gives you something to do every day you come home from work, and a sense of purpose despite the fact that you might only have a couple of hours each night to invest into a game. Along the way, I unlocked a catalog of characters and alts to play whenever I felt like trying something new, but the 1 or 2 characters that I devoted to this reputation grind were the ones that I played first every single time I booted up World of Warcraft. I ran into some minor grinds that I could just do for fun, like unlocking all the mounts at the Argent tournament from Wrath of the Lich King, or farming the mounts from Karazhan, both the old ones and the new, but there was always something to set my sights on. If you want to spend a couple 100 hours exploring every corner of Mechagon, you'll get a mount for it. If you just fell in love with Nazjatar, a couple of mounts are hiding in the rafters and rare mobs. And even if you just want to go kill a couple 100 demons back on Argus, there's a mount waiting for you at the end of that grind too. It's a system of design which ironically works better when you have less experience with the game, because everything from both the current expansion and what came before are all waiting for you to pick and choose which specific things you want to spend your time on. At least up until the point where you already have so many options that unlocking something new starts to become less interesting. This was the general state of the game from my perspective as we made our journey from BFA into Shadowlands, and I was slowly running out of grinds that I actually cared about. What's funny about this is the fact that BFA was a pretty good expansion from the eyes of a casual player. Not only did they add allied races to the game specifically because of BFA, but the more open-minded meta achievements behind Mechagon and Nazjatar gave me something fun to poke around with when I was bored of my other grinds. I never felt bored of the island expeditions or the Warzone system because I never had to really interact with those things the same way that people who chase gear had to do. On top of that, a casual player isn't going to realize how messed up the new dungeon design is for the game because I never really needed any gear above the quality that I found in world quests, considering I wasn't really pushing anything to do with challenge. I knew that these are problems for the hardcore player base because I heard about them every single week. But the plight of a casual player is as blissfully ignorant to the true problems a game has as a 5-year-old kid is to the existence of Santa. I just didn't have the game experience to see the existential dread, the imbalance, the never-ending grind, or infinite stars, oh gods. But this is also coming from a critic who often tries to challenge themselves with the hardest difficulty levels on offer, so what makes WoW so different that I wouldn't even bother to try? And the answer comes down to gear. I do keep a DPS tracker on my interface since the numbers interest me, but this also led me to the understanding that player skill is close to unimportant compared to the level of your gear. When I looked at the damage rankings in a given dungeon or raid, I didn't look at the player in first place as a more skilled individual, but instead someone who just so happened to have 30 to 50 item levels above whatever gear I had on hand. There was never any way to compare whether I was playing well or playing terribly because no one was playing on an even field. So from my perspective, the player who was doing the most damage was at that point due to the time they invested into a repetitive grind for an item that would become obsolete after killing the next boss, and completely ineffective after the next patch. A bunch of people that had put in the same effort for long-term grinds that I had, but they had chosen to do so on a piece of temporary gear, like a revolving door that they just never stopped trying to get to the other side of. It borderlines on insanity that people are willing to invest so much time into something that will inevitably become useless within a month. But then again, other people are probably saying the same thing about the fact that I just spent several days worth of time fishing for a giant bug with a red butt instead of a blue butt. The goal in their case obviously isn't the gear itself, but instead to become a higher tier player, to be the world first, the world's fastest, the world's most deadly player, the best healer, or in some cases just a couple of DPS points ahead of that friend that you want to compete with. I understand why players choose to follow this route for the game, but it's hard for me to ever believe that I could put in the same amount of effort into grinding an item just for the sake of being a little bit stronger, fully knowing that I will recycle that same exact content a couple weeks later. So as Shadowlands released on October 27th, 2020, and everyone was chomping at the bit to rush to max level and start running dungeons for better gear, I was nowhere to be found. I was somewhat distracted playing through Spellforce 3, Valhalla, Cyberpunk, and even Galciv 3 to really bother with the launch of a new expansion for WoW. And in return, I was able to skip the crippling server problems that left some realms stuck in queues for days, as well as the time gating of story content over the first couple months after launch. When I finally did find the time to return to Warcraft, the entire faction campaign system had just become accessible, and even the raid finder for Castle Nathria was just starting to open. I was hopelessly undergeared and behind on all the major grinds that might be necessary to push the harder difficulty levels, but that small caveat hardly mattered to a player that just wanted to see the insides of Raid Finder, and I set off on my journey. The initial goal? 4 characters, 4 Covenant campaign stories, and maybe a Castle Nathria Raid Finder set on the other side, cause the mill set just looked pretty cool to me. Every new character to the expansion has to start off with a sort of story sequence where the heroes of Azeroth chase the anti-hero character Sylvanas into the spirit world. We end up falling into a zone specifically referred to as the Maw, which serves as the prison for the main villain of the storyline, that's called the Jailer. Time works kind of differently in the Shadowlands, so when we find several of our key leaders from both the Alliance and the Horde, it seems as though they've been tortured for quite a long while. The rest of this 30 to 60 minute long introduction sequence follows the champion's experience as you free the nearby captives, attempt to outrun the big bad guys in the area, then make your final escape through a broken down portal to the capital of Oribos. Along the way, the Jailer captures all your allies and the champion becomes the sole survivor of this initial assault on the Maw. Things aren't looking too good after this introduction to the Shadowlands, but the inhabitants of Oribos, this weird ethereal merchant type of race, end up becoming your allies, and we quickly open a portal back to the real world. Using Oribos as a staging point for your forces, the brokers end up introducing us to a creature that used to judge every soul that entered the Shadowlands and send them to the respective realm that suited their abilities best. Among these realms are Bastion, the training grounds for the paragons that ferry souls between the mortal realms and the Shadowlands, Maldraxxus, the Necrolord's training ground for the defensive armies of death, Ardenweld, the bridge between life and death that allows spirits of nature to slowly bide their powers and return to the mortal realms, and finally Revendreth, where the worst of the worst are absolved of their sins and given one last chance to redeem themselves before they are sent to the eternal punishment of the Maw. The main plotline follows a quick journey through each of these areas as we track down each of the 4 paragons to try and enlist their help against the Jailer. The Bastion questline puts you in the role of a newly dead soul as you're forced to complete the rites of atonement for your mortal sins before the paragon will see you. The Maldraxxus paragon is already dead by the time we get there, so the majority of the area is focused around tracking down his betrayers and unlocking the keys to the inner sanctum for more clues. The Ardenweld Night Queen refuses to help the player until you push back the Dressvar in the area, and the Paragon of Revendreth just so happens to be one of the bad guys, so that zone follows your journey to set up a resistance force and try to take control of the area away from the Jailer. By the end of these journeys, we haven't really accomplished much of anything. Revendreth still belongs to Sire Denathrius, Maldraxxus is still primarily warring amongst itself, Ardenweld is still sucking Big Bear dry for mana juice, and Bastion is being converted into an army of Forsworn by the power of despair. It's kind of hard to keep track of the minor details behind what you're doing at any one point in time because there's always a sense that your actions aren't really having any effect on the world. During the leveling process, you really are just getting introduced to each area, the associated faction, and testing out the abilities they can give you once you finally get to the end game. This covenant system ends up serving as the max level motivator to continue doing stuff, as most of the late game power gains come from the use of several covenant systems. First off, each covenant has an associated passive ability that remains the same no matter what class you are, like a short blink ability for Revendreth, a corpse shield for Maldraxxus, a speed boost travel form for Ardenwald, and a Swolkin butler from Bastion. Then each covenant also gives the player a class-specific ability that can range from long-range cooldowns to single-target rotation spells to AoE big hitters to fundamental reworkings for a class style, all based on which covenant you choose. So theoretically, each covenant should reward the players in different areas of play, like one being better at Mythic Plus while one excels at single target, while another excels in PvP. But mostly it always felt like one particular skill would stand out head and shoulders above the rest. The druids have a choice between an ability called Convoke the Spirits, which allows you to cast 20 spells within 4 seconds, or a 10% damage increase for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Regardless of which one is technically more powerful, pressing the button on Convoke the Spirits feels awesome every single time I press it, which means that most druids are going to choose Night Fae no matter what the other options are. So most covenants seem to stand out to me on the nature of their class ability alone, as the Necrolord's Primordial Wave ability was the hands down best option for my elemental shaman. The warlock was a toss-up between the Bastion resource generator skill and the Night Fae mobility boost, and finally my paladin would have been Bastion if I was planning on tanking, but the Revendreth mega consecration skill was just too good to pass up for a ret paladin. I never had to go to any external sites to tell me which skill was the best to use, because I could already just tell by pressing the buttons in game and figuring out which ones actually felt like they worked, while the other ones kind of just felt boring to use. And here lies the major conflict of Shadowlands, as two groups subscribe to different opinions about the Covenant system. Either you pick a Covenant for the story, the transmog sets, the mounts, and the lore reasons, or you pick your Covenants based on power. And while I thought I was going to be one of the former players who cared more about the cosmetic choices simply based on what I liked most about the game, I found myself being drawn to the Covenants that were better for the second-to-second combat encounters. So even though I never had any intentions of showing up on a DPS meter, I ended up falling into the best slot Covenants for each class simply based on the fact that their primary skill was often the most fun to use in any situation. Is it surprising that most druids ended up playing Night Fae and most Death Knights picked Maldraxxus? No, the theme matches up perfectly between both combos, but the fact that the class ability in both of those situations stands above the rest also helps guide players in the right direction. At the end of the day, I personally wanted to play a Bastion Druid coming into the expansion because I just thought the leather armor set looked so cool compared to all the rest, but the difference in fun between Covenant skills was so large that even a dirty casual decided to go with combat power over transmog. Ultimately, I did end up getting a character to max level for all 4 of the Covenants, despite the fact that you can complete the main storylines on each Covenant with a single character due to the catch-up mechanics and the Renown system. I've mentioned this mechanic a couple of times up until this point, but the vast majority of the Covenant rewards are first locked behind a stat called Renown. For players that were keeping up with the system as the cap slowly increased each week, there were 3 ways to earn Renown. A weekly quest to earn 1000 anima, which should take between 4 to 10 world quests depending on how lucky you get with the random rewards, or both dungeon clears and raid bosses, which generally give 35 anima each kill. A weekly quest to collect souls in the Maw, which are a set of ghosts you can interact with in the pseudo-max level zone that you will explore for rep, and a resource called Stygia. And finally, the Covenant campaign, which generally awards 1 level of Renown at the end of each main quest chain, and should speed up your progress up until the halfway point of Renown level 23. As for the catch-up mechanic, if you're ever behind the curve for the maximum possible renown up until that point, a wide variety of content will start to award renown points. Defeating the open world raid, completing dungeons, defeating raid bosses, the Torghast Weekly, the weekly dungeon rep quest, winning PvP matches, and the new calling system can all award you extra points of renown in order to catch up to the pack as soon as possible. In my experience, this was all enough to basically allow me to complete the Covenant main quest and reach 23 renown within a week of hitting max level on a new character, making it incredibly easy to catch alts up to speed as long as you're doing any type of group endgame content. Even if you aren't really interested in the Covenant storyline, it will still be worth working your way through the quest lines in order to unlock your Covenant set, which can later be upgraded to eye level 197 by using Anima, which should allow you to break into any of the harder gameplay systems with a decent set of gear if you choose to take this route. But for those players more concerned about the transmog side of things, these sets offer a wide variety of options for any character between the Vampiric Venthyr sets and the Heavenly Bastion sets alone. The only problem with this? You can't transmog into a Covenant set that belongs to a group you currently aren't pledged to, meaning that if you went through the trouble of unlocking all 4 sets for one character, you would only be able to transmog your gear into the one set belonging to the Covenant you're currently a member of and earning renown points for. It kind of makes sense considering the developers wanted players to feel a sense of ownership over the Covenant they chose to pledge themselves to instead of switching based on flavor of the month type of things. But this also meant that the druid that I think would look really cool in the Bastion set is never going to get the chance to actually wear that set and also use the Convoke spell at the same time, as long as we're still in the Shadowlands. Given the fact a similar thing happened with the legendary weapons back in Legion, it's likely that this restriction on Covenant set transmog will eventually be lifted with the release of whatever expansion comes next, but that's still a long time away. Suddenly, the Covenant system that seems like it should give a casual player 4 different tracks of rewards to pursue simply restricts players into picking one and sticking with it, since you can't even use the other unlocks like mounts and back pieces without having the relevant group membership activated at the time. Ironically, this leaves me just as annoyed with the Covenant system as a min-maxer that wants to use the best ability for every different type of game content, although for entirely more superficial reasons than that min-maxer. So if progression players get a decent starting armor set, and the collectors get a whole list of goodies from the campaign, what about the lore fans? Well, thankfully I think that most of the plot-based fans of Warcraft will end up enjoying the Covenant campaigns, considering the fact that the overall plot really struggles to come together unless you put in the effort to go through each and every Covenant quest. Only together do the 4 pieces end up shining light on all the 4 corners of the plot threads left by the leveling experience. The Venthyr campaign explains the backstory for one of the dungeons called Sanguine Depths, and the reason Prince Ranathal was able to amass the power he needed to confront his father during the first raid. The Maldraxxus storyline resolved the assassination conflict between the War Primarchs, as well as introducing Kel'Thuzad as a key lackey for the jailer. The Bastion storyline explains the Spires of Ascension dungeon, as well as resolving the Forsworn threat and trying to redeem Uther from despair. And finally, the Ardenwell questline follows 3 short stories as you help out the Night Elves as they track down Tyrande. You set up the backstory for the Other Side dungeon, and they set up a key villain as the Drusvar attempt to invade the Winter Queen's realm. Altogether, 3 of the max level dungeons are only explained by their respective Covenant campaigns. We get a better setup for the current raid, 2 major villains are set up as possible leaders for the next couple raids, and Uther returns to the fold as a possible main character for the Forces of Good now that he's left the Forsworn. The main quest during the leveling experience gave me the distinct impression that I was doing busy work for people that didn't care about me, while the Covenant quest consistently threw characters into set-piece moments that it's likely that only 1/4 of the player base is ever going to pay attention to. Regardless, even though this is all certainly a step up from the introductory questline, several of the arcs are shared between Covenants, like the fact that both the Maldraxxus end scenario and the Venthyr end scenario end up sharing the last couple of bosses with each other. I wouldn't necessarily call this lazy game design, design, since it's also some of the better WoW content I've seen put together, but it also undermines both of these campaigns, since the Venthyr parts of that cutscene make very little sense from the Maldraxxus perspective, and the entire assault on the House of Rituals comes out of left field for the Revendreth player. WoW's storytelling has always been messy by its base design, so it's no wonder that you'll get the best overall perspective of what's going on by playing through all 4 options. But what struck me was the fact that I genuinely had fun paying attention to what was happening during each of these campaigns, as the Shadowlands setting allowed developers to take a much more inventive approach to storytelling than they even accomplished near the end of BFA. I'm genuinely excited for the possibility of them continuing on these storylines, not only because they left us with minor plot threads to fulfill, but also because set-piece quests are starting to become fun on their own merits. In summer, I think lore fiends are going to have a good time with the campaign, as well as finally starting to craft a solid single-player story experience that doesn't feel like it's wasting the player's time. Of course, this is only the beginnings of the Covenant system, as future Renown unlocks will continue to make more transmog sets purchasable, along with mounts, pets, and back pieces galore. If only they weren't locked to Covenant-specific characters, so I might feel a reason to try and earn these things. Alongside this all lies the Soulbind system that allows the players to inherit certain powers and utility options from a set of characters belonging to their Covenant. These things can vary so far as a percentage chance to drop piles of random materials, decreased durability damage on death, or more substantive things like a 10% damage increase when attacking an enemy above 75% health. The mechanical difference between both of those things is so substantive that we're talking about a straight up 10% DPS buff for a quarter of each fight, while other soulbinds allow you to fight for 10 seconds after death, or in some cases a stacking mastery stat buff. So between this system that's handing out 10% DPS buffs, the ability system where many classes have one option that stands head and shoulders above the rest, and yet the developers are telling players that their Covenant choice should be primarily based on aesthetics and theme. For a player like me, I can ignore most of the power gains to focus on the transmog side of things, but you're gonna dangle those fat DPS bonuses in front of the face of a Mythic raider and still try to tell them that their personal taste matters? It's insulting that a developer tied power gains to aesthetic choice in this way, fully knowing that 40% of the player base that tries to take themselves seriously was going to be pissed off with this system. And while they've been able to avoid too much controversy up until this point by limiting the buffs and nerfs to Covenant-related power gains, this backs Blizzard into a corner if they ever do decide that one ability is overtuned compared to another and try to switch up the values halfway through the expansion. I think the Covenants were initially a good idea, since everyone likes a good faction system to pledge yourself to and earn rewards for your time, but then too many power systems bled into the choice along the way. Someone might try to argue that the power systems had to be linked to the Covenants, since the Renown stat is the best gauge for how much time a player has put in on a max level character, but that would just be closed-minded. After all, we're talking about a developer that put in an energy crystal system that blocks players off from changing out certain abilities on the Soulbind system at a rate that replenishes as fast as 1 energy ball per 8 hours. This is supposedly to force players away from the temptation to change out their Soulbind abilities for every single fight in the game, just like they put an increasingly restrictive lock on how often players can change their talents or specialization without taking the time to retreat to a safe zone. An incredibly complicated restriction system attached to the Soulbind system, attached to the Renown system, attached to the Covenant system, where the only purpose is to limit the ability of the top 10% of the game to do whatever the fuck they want to do. This doesn't even affect me. This doesn't affect pet battlers, or alt levelers, or even most raiders and Mythic Plus fans. No, if the developers think it's worth the effort to put in a system like this just to restrict the top couple thousand players of the game, then they could put in the effort to break apart the power gains from the transmog progression for this expansion. Now, if you're a new player that got this far in the critique and you're left somewhat confused by the last paragraph I just ranted about, that's going to be more or less perfectly normal unless you had prior experience with the expansion and know exactly which systems I'm talking about. Modern World of Warcraft has really started to feel like a giant bag of systems placed on systems, and frankly, I've only even mentioned half of the endgame progression currencies and mechanics up until this point, all of which are incredibly numbers heavy and terribly hard to explain when you're not looking at them from inside the game. But then again, this side of World of Warcraft is what a lot of players love about the game, since this isn't just your typical story-based single-player experience. To many people, these endgame systems represent the real meat of the experience, as each character is presented with enough individual choices that the most efficient answer has to be calculated by algorithms and complicated simulations. Earlier on, I talked about how fun the combat was to actually play once you get used to it, but now we're starting to reach the point where the depth of the actual statistics is starting to rear its head, near the same point in a player's journey that they might actually start to pay attention to things like secondary stats. As you leveled up to the current max, there was never any need to look at the character pane all that much, and equipping the next item is as easy as seeing green numbers and getting a feeling like your character is growing stronger over time. But now that the Soulbind system is starting to mention some specific things like mastery and haste, like you should know what that means, it's like the player is getting re-educated about just what type of game they're really playing. WoW divides its stats into two categories, with the primary stats of strength, agility, intellect, and stamina, versus the secondary stats of haste, mastery, versatility, and crit. Each class ends up specializing in a different main stat, like warriors with strength, hunters with agility, and mages with intellect, which helps determine how hard their spells and abilities end up hitting the enemy, while stamina more or less helps everyone by providing more health and defense. The secondary stats end up augmenting more specific things like crit, that increases the percentage chance to do 2 times normal damage on any given attack. Haste, which reduces cast time and increases resource regeneration. Versatility, which applies a flat percentage increase to damage and healing. And mastery, which does a completely different thing for each class and specialization. These are the 8 stats that typically make up every single piece of gear in modern WoW, other than the base defense on armor and damage numbers on weapons. While at its core the system is pretty easy to explain, but things start to get complicated when the stats interact with each other, and suddenly your crit chance is being passively increased by a good haste number, while also benefiting directly from versatility. Is it worth taking a piece of gear with 1 more unit of main stat, but 1 less unit of mastery? What about another piece with 2 more intellect, but 10 less haste? The meaning of the stats is simple to understand, but the math can quickly get out of control when we're talking about exchanging pieces of gear with hundreds of secondary stats for each other. And the answer that the top players in the world ended up using? Simulations on every single piece of gear, every single time it drops, because the math is honestly just that complicated that your average human is better off letting the computer do it for you. This creates a weird meta where there comes a certain point where theory crafters more or less cease to exist, since the algorithms can do a better job figuring out the best options to use, suddenly making the 3 specializations per class get simplified into the 1 or 2 options per character that most players are going to choose from. Regardless, there are so many different spells, abilities, items, trinkets, and toys with unique and stacking effects that certain players are able to do some crazy theory crafting to go one-shot other people in PvP, but for the vast majority of people, the meta is well entrenched, easy to fall into with only a passing glance at your options, and incredibly hard to outrun if you're one of the 5 people that actually wants to play a survival hunter. But let's say you accept the vast mathematic depths of this stat system, and you either rely on the algorithms to do things for you, or you like crunching your own numbers, and maybe this is the thing that you really love about WoW. So you've caught up on Renown, completed the Covenant campaign, and earned a decently passable set of armor to do more or less whatever you want to do in the endgame. By this point, many players will have already started to explore the Maw area, which tries to serve as a sort of you're not supposed to be here type of area that slowly works up a wanted level the more time you spend there. Initially, it's pretty easy. Things like more mobs will attack you on sight, or an artillery piece will fire at you every once in a while, but once you hit the max wanted level in the area, the jailer will just straight up kill you with no hope of surviving. The reason players might want to do this is to complete reputation quests for a character named Venari to open up their shop and buy some of the upgrades that will make it easier to do things whenever you're in the maw. Sigils that protect you from the increasing wanted levels, or a mini Hearthstone that can teleport you to the entrance of the maw. It always felt like the game was trying to make me want to farm things in the maw simply to make farming things in the maw easier. Possibly to buy a handful of account upgrades that can make the secondary system in the maw called Torghast just a little bit easier. This roguelike system of repeatable content tasks the player with climbing more and more difficult layers of the tower in order to farm a resource called Soul Ash. This currency can then be combined with certain craftable items in order to make legendary gear with the traditional orange lettering that you can only equip one piece of at a time. These legendary items are supposed to be above the curve, with both extraordinary stats on them as well as the ability to put unique characteristics that can fundamentally change the nature of your gameplay. Pretty cool the first time you get them, except that most players will have been earning these types of items since Legion, if not Mist of Pandaria, when the orange text first became commonplace. So I, of course, started working on grinding the materials to craft my first piece of this gear as soon as I got to max level. But given the rather low quality gear I had on hand when I first hit the level cap, I soon understood it might take me 2 or 3 weeks to earn enough Soul Ash to make my first legendary. Fine enough, except that I was also able to complete the Covenant campaign within the first week at max level, earning enough gear that already could be upgraded past the item level of the lowest tier of legendary items. So now I still wanted a legendary that would be somewhat of an upgrade, and the second level of legendary items comes in at eye level 210. Okay, but the Soul Ash also increases from 1250 to 2000, and suddenly that seems like it might take around 3 to 4 weeks of running Torghast, depending on how hard I want to push myself with the difficulty rewards. Mind you, I've already completed all the story content for the expansion. I have enough item level to join the raid finder and earn the new transmog sets, and I basically have enough gear to solo any world quest I might want to do. And a casual player is supposed to still be interested in grinding several weeks for a piece of gear that they basically have no need for? Whatever. I picked up the profession items just to see if there was anything worthwhile at the end, and the transmog is cool enough, but then we're looking at another problem where you can't collect those looks to use on other items in a similar way to what happened with the Covenant sets. Lead developer even Hazakostas made a post that they will eventually unlock the transmog capabilities for these pieces later in the expansion, but that certainly doesn't help me feel a need to do the content now. Otherwise, the Torghast runs are pretty fun on their own merit the first couple times you run through them. The player can pick up randomized powers specific to your class and spec throughout each run, slowly making your character stronger as you attempt to keep up with the increasing difficulty on harder sets of levels. The powers are indeed pretty cool to use, until you see the same ones pop up every single time you go through the dungeon, fighting the same mobs several times on each character as they rotate on a weekly basis between the 6 total options. And I've mentioned the first couple times you do this because in the early patches for Shadowlands, each character a player got to max level had to slowly work their way up the difficulty options until you reach the best rewards that you could achieve. Something I think they've already patched out of the game so that all characters on an account share the same difficulty options, but you're still looking at between 5 to 10 runs of Torghast for every single piece of legendary gear that you want to craft. And that's 5 to 10 runs that take between 30 minutes to 2 hours if you're a person who tries to take their time and push the harder difficulties on a character, and 5 to 10 runs where you don't receive any rewards for your time if you fail to beat the final boss without dying less than 3 times. 5 to 10 runs where you can lose your progress at any point if you disconnect from the server due to bad internet. The first 10 or so runs of Torghast that I did were pretty fun, I'm not gonna lie, but now that I've entered Torghast around 30 to 40 times across several characters, and none of them have earned enough currency to unlock a single legendary that would be an upgrade to their current gear, and suddenly things are starting to feel rather repetitive. Mind you, this is coming from a player who spent 60 hours fishing in the game at one point, but the idea of spending another 5 to 10 hours grinding out Torghast levels where I'm going to see the same mobs and powers pop up time after time with a character that's already completed all the endgame content I currently want to see for an item that isn't actually necessary and a transmog that I won't be able to use for perhaps another half a year. This is definitely fun for someone. It's just not me. So what else is there for a max level casual to do? I already did the raid finder in order to see the conclusion of the current story content, but I also kind of liked the look of the current mail set for my shaman, and suddenly I had something worth grinding for in the game. Every week I'd try logging in to do the raid finder, doing between 3 to 9 bosses depending on how much time I had, and hoping against all odds that the right items dropped. The first week I was incredibly lucky and earned 3 items in a single clear. But then I started to see the item drought that most of the player base have been complaining about in Shadowlands. At this point, I call it a lucky raid to receive even just a single item after investing several hours clearing all 10 bosses, but there's also a chance that the item happens to be one of the ones that I already had, and suddenly those handful of hours I put in feel almost completely worthless. Maybe I had fun learning the mechanics and getting better at the fights over time, but the large majority of these raid finder journeys I take look like they're progressing at 10 frames per second with a ping of 15,000. That's essentially a delay of 15 seconds between what everyone else is supposed to be seeing and what I see, although I can sometimes get that down to a ping of 250 if I play between the hours of 1 AM and 3 AM. Dude, just buy better internet, or your computer must be lacking to get those types of FPS. And at the time, that was true. My computer broke during the last critique that I did, and so I had to go out and buy a new computer, and I ended up switching out my modem to get an upgraded internet plan, and everything works fine now. The FPS is pretty stable, and the ping is only at around 80, which is very easy to play with. But that won't always be the case for every single person. Not everyone is going to have the privilege of being in an area where good Wi-Fi is available, or they might not always have the money to invest into a computer with a SSD, even though that's becoming more and more available over time. So I know fully well there's going to be other people with worse setups than what I used to have, and suddenly I have to acknowledge the fact that there's a good chance that WoW might just not work very well for you, despite the fact that millions of people live and die by the game. According to the forums, if you don't live where the majority of the player base lives, you're probably just going to have a bad time. Say if you live halfway between where the Oceanic realms are focused and where the North American realms are focused, neither option is going to give you a good ping. And if you do live in a part of the country where internet service isn't top quality, suddenly the group content that most people love about the game might just not even be accessible, assuming you can even connect to the servers in the first place. In American culture, it seems like we've developed a sense that every person on the planet more than likely has several megabytes of download speed per second, regardless of the fact that some people in the Americas consider it an improvement when they can break above the 200 kilobyte per second mark. So content creators typically are coming from the perspective where they don't get to see what the less fortunate are looking at when they just so happen to be at the bottom of the DPS rankings. When I had that bad setup, I entered a raid, I got within range of the boss, and I spammed the primary attack key while reading the chat to try and get a good idea about whether the boss might have died, because I wasn't going to see it happen on my screen for another 2 to 3 minutes after the boss died. Playing WoW in this way absolutely was not a good time, but when you really want to get that transmog, I understand why people are motivated to deal with 20,000 ping in order to get the coolest new set available. I'm not even kidding. I have seen my ping climb above 20,000 in World of Warcraft, and I think that's enough of a problem that new players should be made aware of it if you don't live somewhere with good internet. So at the time, it didn't matter how much I wanted to explore the higher difficulty options. I was never going to be able to until I upgraded my set to both have enough frames per second as well as a low enough ping to even have the ability to start participating in that type of content. But if you are in one of those bad situations with multiple thousand ping at a time, how do you still get a good idea of what the general player base feels about the game? The real answer is that you can practically keep up with World of Warcraft entirely through the content creators that cover the MMO full time. So after showing even just a hint of interest in the World of Warcraft news coverage scene, my YouTube recommended bar will be absolutely filled with a plethora of options for me to choose from. Do you want the WoW news from the perspective of a world first raider that's always pushing the hardest content? Go check out Preach Gaming. Do you want a professional approach to WoW news that frequently interrupts itself with advertisements from NordVPN? Go check out Bellular. Do you want a more inclusive space with a focus on pet battles and mount collecting for fun? Go check out Hazelnutty Games. The breadth of options when it comes to World of Warcraft content is actually pretty incredible, kind of highlighting the fact that different types of people can all find a place to call their own in the WoW universe. Now, despite this, there remains the fact that most of the more popular creators focus on the type of content that we've already determined only 40% of the player base takes part in. Entire channels like Zaryu and Peekaboo are devoted to rated PvP, and if you want to get even more niche than that, you can always watch Soulscape, who focuses on the open world aspects of PvP if that's more your thing. Alongside this, the big events for things like the World First Race on the new Mythic raid and the MDI Mythic Plus tournament routinely catch millions of views over the course of the couple weeks each time a new season comes out, all of which draws in enormous crowds of people that don't want to do this content for themselves and yet are willing to watch others do this instead. This is esports, almost exactly the logical equivalent to the type of person that turns on the football game every Sunday, except that in this case people are doing the same thing with a video game. Most people try to debate the very existence of esports like they can't even fathom the ability of another human to enjoy watching someone else play video games, and yet, in the very same breath, those people are more than happy to spend their entire weekend watching the Golf Open. And that makes perfect sense to me, specifically because that's their hobby. In the same way that your average gamer gets to relax by playing through a dungeon in World of Warcraft, experiencing the open world of Valhalla, or cracking open a new city builder to dive into after work. That golf player fantasizes about the round of 18 he'll get to play with his buddies over the weekend. So the appeal of watching professionals absolutely wreck the hobby that you only spend your limited free time on has a universal appeal, whether you're watching to try and learn from the top-ranked players, or you simply want to see what's actually possible at the highest echelons of human skill. There's something about the human psyche that truly loves watching a master at work, as we appreciate the thousands of hours in practice that skill would take to achieve ourselves. It allows players to live vicariously, to try and imagine what it would be like to be in that position of mastery yourself without having to invest the same portion of your life into the pursuit. So however much I may dream of having the free time, the money, the drive, the internet, the connections, and the skill to one day push myself into the higher stratospheres of WoW content, I'm also just as satisfied being able to simply watch those people from afar with a sense of awe and fascination. My free time was saved from the yawning void of a several thousand-hour-long journey from zero to hero, so now I can spend it on other worthwhile pursuits, like writing college dissertations about video games. But then I'm left with a lackluster sense of World of Warcraft expertise and a rather average writing ability that excels in length more than it ever does in substance. Whatever am I to do now? I almost named this critique a love letter to World of Warcraft because that's how I really feel about the game, despite any conflicts between the general setup of new systems and my goals as a casual. So despite the fact that I haven't put in the time to become a god gamer, that I don't have any one particular area of expertise or dedication to the grind compared to other content creators, what I do have is an appreciation for the community that makes WoW content, and a need to put out something that can give back to that community. Maybe that means that I can give voice to a portion of gamers that aren't really talked about in the WoW community, the dirty casuals that we are, but more likely is that there's a portion of viewers that just like hearing people talk about the game that they love. After all, I too watch every single Preach Gaming video that comes out, fully knowing that none of the actual problems that he runs into will ever affect me or my gameplay. Instead, we watch those players out of a morbid sense of fascination with a special interest that we're just as likely to actually participate in as the people who watch the weekly baseball talk shows. Because having a team to root for, an individual you aspire to be, a savant to guide you through the darkness, all hinges on the social aspects that make MMOs truly special. As you make your way through the world, there will be people by your side every step of the way. Maybe not directly in your face like it used to be at the launch of WoW Classic, but still close enough that at any moment you want to talk to another person, it's as easy as reaching out to the general chat. If you don't want to interact with people, the game is just as capable of giving you things to do, but it's the fact that there does exist a button that you can press to magically get matched up with other humans that makes the experience something else entirely. Knowing that there's other people doing the same thing as you, running in circles around Dalaran, watching you excel or fail miserably in each dungeon you enter, inspecting your transmog because they think you look cool, or looking down on others because they think a higher achievement number makes their dick bigger. It's the community that makes this game transcend simply collecting all the things, because no one will know when you collect all the silver keys in Fable, but everyone can see when you earn the super rare mount that took you several weeks of farming to get. So players fall into this hole where they're not only collecting things in order to just have fun, but also because those rare items might just hold the same social value that other people find in buying a Ferrari in real life. Like I mentioned nearly an hour ago, people don't simply play World of Warcraft. They exist in the World of Warcraft world. A second life with its associated achievements, wealth, and social status that is somehow able to drag people in without them noticing the fact that this is only slightly less cringy than playing the actual game called Second Life. And that's something that I think should be celebrated. Whether or not that means that you spend 50 hours going from level 1 to 60 on your first character, or if you still find yourself grinding a fishing mount at the tail end of 1,000 hours played. There's still 100 tiny details I could try and tell you about the WoW experience, but I think that most listeners will have made a final opinion about the game long before this point in the critique. So if there's even a single person that was able to learn a little bit more about World of Warcraft, then that would make this video worth it in my mind. And maybe, just maybe, I did a better job expressing my opinions on the new Shadowlands expansion than the IGN review did, that everyone basically ended up hating. Not much of a surprise there, but if you enjoyed this type of content, feel free to subscribe to get notifications whenever I post new videos on my upcoming projects like Civilization 3 and possibly Nebuchadnezzar, or if you didn't like it, downvote the shit out of it. Remember, my name is Taliesin and Evitel. No, that's not right. My name is JB Jet, and I hope you have a fantastic day, week, month, or year until I have a chance to talk to you again. Bye. 30-odd Build 10 murlocs, or apply first aid to some shipwrecked sailors. Well, that's hard to say. Yep. Of course. Excuse me? You're not actually playing the game until you hit max level? Everything before that point is just outdated content that doesn't matter. End of patch raids, which are typically designed for groups of 24 of 25 players. Down type of game. As long as you keep Ew. Up until the point you hit mask level, meh. Of ads in the dungeon while defeating all the bosses under a time limit, your war, yeah. So I never really fell head over heels for the game until the launch of the Legion expansion and the release of allied races. Ew. Why? It borderlines on insanity that people are willing to invest so much time in. Ew. The druids have a choice between an ability called Convoke. Ew. The Bastion storyline explains the Spires of Ascension. Meh. The Maldraxxus storyline resolved the assassination conflict between the War Primarchs, as well as introducing Kel'Thuzad, as well as introducing Kel'Thuzad as you help out the Night Elves as they track down Tyrande and set up a backstory to meh. And finally, the Ardenwell questline follows 3 short stories as you help out the wow. Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, this is bad. Bad. These are the 8 stats that typically make up every single piece of gear in Modern War. Nah. Suddenly making the 3 specializations per class. Nah. Ew. The real answer is that you can practically keep up with World of Warcraft entirely through. Oh god. Oops. Gross. Maybe not directly in your face like it used to be at the launch of WoW Meh.